Hi, folks. It's time for my yearly re-record. I'm going to try to do this a little bit more often because my supporters deserve to be thanked, and I want to keep things more up to date going forward. First off, thank you for returning to the Whiskey Ring. If this is your first time here, or if you're a frequent listener, please take the moment to like and subscribe, rate and review wherever you found the podcast. If you have suggestions for how to make the podcast better, or guests or topics you'd like to hear, please reach out to me at david@whiskeymyweddingring.com or via Facebook or Instagram. Second, I want to thank my vintage level sponsors, those at the highest level who keep this podcast going. Truly, without these supporters, I would have had to stop doing this a long time ago. Thank you specifically to Don, to John and Jim, Bill and Connor, Steve, Jake and Bill, Trevor, Michael and Jesse, Jared, Brendan and Larry, Logan, Patrick and Andrew, Dustin, Wade and Gavin, Daniel, and Justin. Thank you all for supporting, listening, telling your friends about this podcast. Cannot stress enough how much you all make this possible to go forward. If you haven't yet joined the Patreon, please consider doing so at patreon.com/whiskeymyweddingring. You can support for as little as $5 a month, where you can have access to ad-free episodes, and will also have priority if a vintage spot becomes available. Those spots are strictly limited, so if a spot becomes available, you're going to want to be the first to know. Lastly, going forward, I am trying to be better about posting show notes for each episode on my website, whiskeymyweddingring.com. These show notes will have links to websites and socials for my guests, and will also have additional information not in the interview, including reviews and tasting notes whenever possible or relevant. Thank you everyone for listening, and I hope to have you back as a listener next week. Hey folks, welcome to a new episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. Today we are back in my home state of New York, and I am thrilled to be visiting a distillery that I've been to twice in person, and now get to talk to one of the founders at his Hillrock Estate Distillery in Ancram, New York. And I'm talking today with Jeffrey Baker. Jeff, welcome on.
David, so nice to be here. Thank you for having us.
Absolutely, glad to. So as I said, I've gotten to visit the Hillrock Estate twice now, once with Kurt Maitland's Manhattan Whiskey Club, shout out to Kurt, and once on my own. And I've had a couple of bottles over the course of my whiskey tenure of Hillrock Estate, and I was trying to find which ones I still have with me. And it turns out the two I still have are both double cask ryes that I got last time I was up there, and both owner's cask selections. So I'll bring those up later, but I wanted to just set the scene on that one.
Sounds like you might be a rye fan, David.
I am, for sure.
Excellent. Good choice.
So let's start off where we normally start, the origin story. And I wanted to kind of give an outline to see if I had this all right. So if I have the timeline right, the property, the estate that you're currently sitting on, was originally bought in 1995, comprising about 250 acres. A couple of years later, by 2000, the captain's house, Israel Harris' house, was moved on site. The distillery build-out starts in 2010, and operations start in 2011. Is that all good so far?
That's very good.
All right. So throughout this, the early history, there are a couple points that I wanted to ask you about because I was a little unsure. So the first one, and perhaps the most foundational, is, of course, Dave Pickerell. He's come up a number of times on this podcast. I unfortunately started this a couple of years after he passed, so never got to meet him. But, of course, his legacy is felt throughout the industry. When did you first meet Dave and get in touch to bring him on as a consultant?
Well, so, if you'll allow me, I'll digress backwards a little bit just in terms of what caused us to start Hillrock and all of that, which is I grew up working on farms as a kid and, ultimately found myself in New York City in 1986. And pretty quickly, I realized I needed a foundation again. I had to be kind of connected back to the land. So I bought my first farm in 88 or 89. And I had one of the early rotational grazed dairy herds in the East Coast. And before that, or after that, I had pasture raised beef. And then we relocated to our new property As you said, it was in the mid 90s, and we were looking for what we could do here that would be really world class and in kind of the value add farming space. And as it turned out, something like at least half the barley and rye for the whole country was grown in New York in the early 1800s. And there were probably 1,000 farm-based distilleries here in New York alone before Prohibition. So I started really looking at that. The fellow who had built our house in 1806, the captain, was a grain merchant after the war, and he became pretty successful and built a terrific house. So it was clear to me that you could do that. Whiskey had a real tradition in the area, probably largely rye-based whiskeys, and that grain could be grown here, which it wasn't by 2000 and in the 2000 era, pretty much it all moved west. So when we started looking at whiskey, we thought of it very much in the context of fine estate wineries, where you were growing all of your own grain, just like in a winery growing all of their own grapes and do all the processes on site. So the reason we reached out to Dave was because I wanted to make single field world class whiskeys that were terroir based. And Dave was really the only person in the industry at that time, 2009, 2010, that was speaking about terroir and whiskey in the same breath. So I literally reached out to him in 2010, late 2010, um, reached him, got him up to our farm about 2 weeks later. And the two of us literally sat at the kitchen table and planned out the whole concept and design for the first estate whiskey distillery in the US. Um, so Dave was an amazing person. He probably, I would argue, there were maybe a dozen people of his caliber in the industry at that point, and he thought that the concept was a terrific one and would ultimately be accepted by the industry in general and become a lot more of a mainstream concept. But anyway, so you excuse me for digressing a bit, but I thought
No,
that might be helpful.
no, of course, and it's worth noting because it's extremely relevant for today, even as it was 15, 16 years ago. I do have a question or two later on about the Estate Whiskey Alliance, so we'll be coming back to that
Yeah.
for sure. One tidbit that Dave had said, there's only one source that had this. Dave was on the Speakeasy podcast. This is way back in 2013. And he mentioned that the property had had a distillery since around 2000. It's the only source that mentioned that date, so I wasn't totally sure, but I wanted to check with you as to whether there was any distillation prior to 2010, 2011.
No, no, actually, when we bought the property, it was all open farmland. So we purpose built the entire distillery really around that concept. So the idea was to build the distillery in the middle of the farm so that when you were in the tasting room looking out at the fields, you may well be drinking whiskey that came from that field that you're looking at. We now farm about 800 acres, all within around 5 miles of the distillery. So we pretty quickly expanded our footprint and added quite a bit of additional different soil types, different orientations, so that we could really explore that terroir even further.
And I think you alluded to this just now as well, but was Dave involved in the initial equipment purchase and really the design of the buildings? I know you have a background as an architect as well. So
hmm
was was anything built by the
Dave,
time
there
you came
was
on?
no,
Mhm.
there was nothing here. It was all we. Dave was with us from the start, and effectively was we really partnered with Dave to build out the whole concept. So we designed the facility jointly. Dave created all the specified all the equipment. We made a lot of customization to the Vendome equipment. Um, all the mash bills, all the training, all the quality control, all of that was designed by Dave. And there were really the bulk of Dave's time, while he was involved with a lot of in a smaller way with a lot of distilleries, the vast majority of his time was split between us and Whistlepig. And Dave spent until he passed away in 2018. So for the first 8 years or so of our business, he spent um, 1 week a month on site, and then he was spent quite a bit of time out in the market for us during the other weeks he wasn't on site. But really, we probably between Whistlepig and Hillrock, we took up about 80% of Dave's time.
So one more on Dave, and then we'll move on to a little bit more in the origin story. But that is, uh, Dave had some well-known disagreements with Maker's Mark. No news here, but that led to his departure. Chief among them, his desire to explore and release finishes.
Mhm.
Taking that to Hillrock Estate, nearly all of your products have at least one, maybe two, three, four finishes involved with them. How much of that is from kind of Dave's proclivities, and how much is from yours and your wife Kathy's vision for the whiskey you wanted to create?
Well, I think it was really probably driven by Dave because he'd been doing experiments with different barrel finishes at makers for many years, and so he had a vast knowledge of what would work with each of the different whiskeys and what wouldn't work. We carried a little bit of a bias from the wine world. I was more of a wine and single malt drinker, so the concept of finishes from the single malt world was something that we were pretty familiar with, and
Hmm.
we totally embraced that. And obviously, from Dave's perspective, when we hired him, we said, Dave, we would be enthusiastically on board with all the finishes that you think would work with our whiskeys. So from day one, we were doing finishes really before almost all of the craft distilleries, and frankly, obviously, at this point, a lot of the big distilleries have followed suit as well, but we were kind of one of the early advocates of that.
For sure. For for you, and this could be for you and or for you and Kathy as a couple, what do you feel was your I want to build a distillery and make whiskey moment?
Um, gosh, I think it was, sort of from kind of the middle to the late 2010 when I was doing all of this research, and I really started looking at whiskey, and I felt that whiskey was where wine was in the 70s. They hadn't embraced the concept of terroir and estate production, which was really the foundation of whiskey making pre-prohibition and pre-industrial revolution. And it seemed to me that the industry had gotten a little bit lost, frankly. Um, so I looked at that and I basically said, this is such an opportunity, the fact that no one has been doing it. And I really almost viewed it as an arms race, so to speak, and that we wanted to command that space and be the leader in it from day one. So we pretty quickly grasped onto that, and then Dave was the perfect person to help us with that. And I honestly don't know how a craft distillery could be a success without someone like Dave. There's just too many things, too much knowledge needed, and too many things that can go wrong.
Mm.
So we were really fortunate to get him. And we pretty much right away, one day I looked up and sat down with my wife and I said, I really want to start a new farming idea, and this is what it is. And surprisingly, she was totally on board with it, and we just launched in and made it happen. Because I think from the time that we had the first call with Dave to the time we had a distillery up and running was about 9 or 10 months.
That just
very fast timeline, as we've seen in other interviews. Something that takes years, usually takes years. And in an early interview, this is 2012, an interview with the Millbrook Independent, you had mentioned that at the time you were really interested in bringing back barley varieties that were good for distilling, would bring a lot of flavor, and that at the time you were working with seed specialists to find
Mhm.
what would work best for the whiskey and for the climate that we're in. What was that process like, and what were the results?
It's a fascinating area, right?
Yeah.
So when I'll never forget, I mean, the first whiskey we actually made was single malt, so barley-based whiskey. But we also were making rye whiskey shortly thereafter and bourbon. And when we tried to source rye seed to plant the first time, no one could even tell you what variety it was. It's just beyond comprehension. They didn't know. So now there's a number of commercially available ryes. There are also there are probably a dozen available commercial barley seeds that strains that can be that we've tried. We've also tried a few in very small way heirloom varieties, but the honest truth is that it's going to take 50 or 100 years for us to all figure out exactly what the best variety is for this location. We've gravitated now in the rye space to an Eastern European variety that's probably pretty similar to what the settlers would have been growing here in the early 1800s. Barleys again are a little more complicated. We've focused in on a couple of different varieties that we like the flavor profiles, and they seem much better suited to our climate. But it's an ongoing battle, so to speak.
Mm.
And, I suspect we would have this conversation another 20 years and we'd be a bit more refined, and hopefully some more of the heirloom varieties will actually be available. But again, you take 4 or 5 seeds out of the seed bank, and it takes years to get them up to a production level where you can actually plant a 10-acre field. So
Right.
and we're not frankly there as an industry yet. There have been a couple rye varieties in other regions that had regional significance that have come back, but in this area we aren't quite there yet.
Do you feel like you'll be, because I know you've, as Hillrock, you've put out a couple of releases that are field specific, as you were
Mhm.
talking about doing terroir of a particular field. Have you also done ones that are varietal specific?
Yeah, it's so each actually all of our rye and single malts are released by individual field and have been for the last several years. And they will be variety specific, but we haven't actually put the varieties on the label because the way we farm our acreage is we have a grain storage and processing facility about 5 miles from our distillery that where we own all the silos, and allows us to harvest each individual field separately and
Mm.
clean it and store it separately. So when we're distilling, it will be designated individual field, specific harvest, specific variety. So we can trace that to every barrel. And we do all small batch individual pot still distillation, unlike
Mm.
a column still, so we can identify and we do track all of that. And it's I have some 12-year-old single malts that we're about ready to release that are same harvest, different fields, and it's
Mm.
fascinating how different they are.
That's anyone listeners to the podcast will know that's something that I love to see is the side by sides. I love doing those uh, with Waterford's whiskeys
Hmm.
from Ireland.
Hmm.
Um, and it's also amazing to think you've already got 12-year-old single malt. That's fantastic for this region, for American whiskey in general. If someone were interested, like I'm clearly a whiskey nerd, I like to know these really nitty gritty details about things. Even though it's not on the label, if someone were to reach out to you or the team and say, "Look, I have this cask number, this label," would you be able or willing to share what that variety is?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're becoming more and more specific about that as time goes on. And we'll put more and more information on the labels. It's just it's a matter of how much overload we can
Yeah.
give people. But we 100% can trace a barrel back to its origin. I mean, more difficult with bourbon, obviously, because it's multiple grains.
Right.
So but for the, for a rye, it's all 100% estate grown rye. And so it's by its nature going to be one variety, one field, one harvest. And the same with single malts.
And just to give people a quick view, I'm not sure we'll have time in the interview to talk about packaging in particular, though it is gorgeous. I mean, Hillrock, you've been consistent since the beginning of having this Chanel No. 5 inspired bottling, and I know I'm getting a little
Yep.
reflection on the light here right now, but I'll have better pictures when the episode comes out. Uh, but as beautiful as it looks head on, it is really designed to be more like a book with this spine showing to the
Hmm.
outside. There we go. Spine showing to the outside. And with the smaller labels, smaller space, as you said, there's only so much you can fit on there without, needing a magnifying glass to read the labels. And like I said, not everyone is a whiskey nerd. Not everyone's going to care what variety comes from what field. That's more niche. That's me. Uh, but
By the way, it has been called Chanel 750. By the way, on
I like.
occasion.
I hadn't heard that. I like that. I I did hear it. This was also in an early interview. Because it was such a fancy bottle, if you will, to use a really diminutive term. I apologize, but like a fancy bottle, people would chug it in the early days and call it getting hill rocked, and I hadn't heard that before.
Oh
But
boy.
so
Well,
yeah,
hopefully they've
it's
matured a bit since then.
hopefully. So for you, we'll move into production. So production started in 2011 with the whiskeys, but you did have some whiskeys that hit several years old shortly thereafter. And from what I could tell, those were whiskeys that Dave had distilled elsewhere, but were brought into Hillrock to kind of get you started and build a profile. Um, how did these earlier whiskeys, fit into your plan, and did they get phased out over time?
Well, okay, so just to be a little bit more specific about that,
Mm,
we started winning awards with 2 and 3 year old whiskeys that were whiskeys that we made at Hillrock and aged in small barrel formats. So Dave was also an expert at maturation, and we were able to. We spent tremendous amount of effort, and cost is obviously much higher to do this, where we would move some of those early whiskeys moved through 5 or 6 different barrels, as small as 10-gallon barrels, to layer on a profile. And so there we the earlier whiskeys that we were winning awards with, well, the majority of those were really Hillrock Estate whiskeys that had been groomed. Now,
mm,
we've always been direct about this when we set up our Solera for aging our bourbon. Dave did source some seed whiskey that we originally seeded the Solera with and put younger estate whiskey into the Solera to give it a bit more age for the starting point. And
mm.
then the Solera over the years has really morphed effectively into our estate whiskey, because we've been adding that into it now for 15 years. So
Mm.
there will always be a little bit of sourced whiskey in there, because with the Solera process, we're never emptying those barrels. But effectively, that was one of the concepts behind the Solera, was to do an elegant version of starting with the source whiskey, which a lot of people do in the industry, but have it morph into our own estate product over time.
Gotcha, gotcha. So it really was just as you said, the seed whiskey as opposed to a kind of longer term solution.
No, yeah, we never wanted to be. I mean, the concept was not to be, I mean, look, we walk down a whiskey aisle now, and we all in the industry know that you're looking at 400 whiskeys, and 350 of those came from a couple of distilleries and just have different labels on them, and that's not what we want it to be long term. It's obviously, you know, hugely less capital intensive than, building a facility, growing all of your own grain. And, the whiskeys we're making now, we're not selling for 10 years. So it's a
Right.
it's a different process and a different kind of a approach to the industry, but we think it's really the one that has the validity long term, and I think consumers are going to understand that.
Sure. So I think as we move into production, we have to talk about floor malting.
Hmm.
You were the first distillery in the U.S. since Prohibition to have their own floor malting, and still, a decade and a half later, still one of only maybe a dozen among the thousands of craft distilleries now running in the country to have their own malting floor. And even in the world, I mean, we're talking a handful.
Right.
And how early in your planning did you know you wanted to have your own floor malting?
Well, when we brought Dave into the fold, I said, Dave, I know you can make bourbon and rye whiskey, but I also want to make the top American single malt, and because I'm really a single malt drinker. And so fortunately, he'd been he's a chemical engineer, and he was consulting for distilleries around the world before he joined Maker's Mark as their master distiller. So he had a lot of experience making Scotch whiskies in Scotland. And so we really, from day one, knew we set up from day one to be able to make single malt as one of our top priorities. And from my perspective, I wasn't going to grow my estate grain and then send it out somewhere to be malted. And there just weren't any facilities, either. Floor malting is a tradition that creates a different kind of a product than vat malting. And today, when we started, it was the only purpose-built floor malting operation at a U.S. distillery. And now there are several, but frankly, there are only a couple that actually have a traditional malt floor in the U.S., as far as I know. And it makes a product that's so unique and so much better. I just, from day one, we decided we needed to do it, so we built a whole building just for that purpose. So it adds a tremendous amount of complexity to our operation, but in our view, it's definitely worth it.
Um, was there a particular either distillery or facility that was the inspiration for how your malting floor was designed, or was it more like this is what a malting floor looks like and fits in the buildings?
Well, we sent a team over to the UK and Scotland to look at facilities before we built ours. And, to be pretty frank, there really aren't anywhere in the world that are the scale of ours. The ones that are remaining are generally much larger, almost industrial versions of floor malting. Ours was more based on what our research told us a individual town somewhere in Europe during the 17 or early 1800s might have had for a malt floor, which they called one-man malt houses. They were usually run by a family, and they were
Hmm.
scaled to create enough beer for the town. And so we had to kind of look at everything and come up with what we thought would be the right solution for us. And frankly, no one knew if it would really work at the time. Exactly. So we did the best we could. As it turned out, it's been we've I don't think we've ever lost a batch of malt in the 16 years, and it's worked pretty darn well. So we have we designed it because once the malt is soaked, once the grain is soaked in water and put out on the malt floor, it's pretty fragile. So we didn't want to move it mechanically after that. So we designed our malt house with the malt floor on the second level. So we'd bucket elevator our grain up to the steep tank, steep, then put it on the malt floor, and then we're able to move it by hand and effectively shovel it through a hatch down into our kiln where it would be smoked and then dried and toasted. And then it gets pushed by hand into a large bin where it's labeled year of harvest, what variety it is, what level of smoke it had on it, if it was smoked. And then that goes back into our warehouse until we're ready to make whiskey with that.
And I'm just thinking too, in the scale of things, when you started off, you had about 250 acres and have more than tripled it over the years. With the 250-gallon Vendome still and the malt floor that you have, like you said, it's smaller scale. With the growth that you have had in the acreage you're farming, and thus the grain that you're farming, have you considered or have you needed to expand the size of either the floor or the distilling apparatus?
Well, I won't. I'll tell you. When we started, there were maybe 200 craft distilleries in the country, so no one knew what was going to happen to this part of the industry, and so we were set up originally with a 250-gallon still and a system to match that. We actually did a large expansion back in 2000 when we started it in 2018, finished it in 19, but it was the last Vendome system that Dave designed before he passed away. And that allowed us to basically more than triple our output. So we moved up to a 500-gallon system, which was the largest we could fit into our space, or we would have done a larger one. Now, our malt floor from day one, we had oversized for our operation, but we're limited to probably doing about 1-ton batches on the malt floor. So we can do a batch every 5 days or thereabouts because we can overlap the batches. So we're still able to we were able to kind of up our production level for the malt house quite a bit just by condensing the batches. So I would, if I was going to do it again, I probably would have made it twice as big as it currently is. But nonetheless, it's still adequate to provide all the malt that we're needing. But at some point, if we were to add a third shift or do something like that, we might want to do some expansion, which we certainly could do.
So as you said, the single malt was the first product off the still for you. And coming back to your own history, as you said, you were a wine and single malt guy when you were drinking pre-Hillrock days. Your own single malt has been described by you, by Jeff, by Dave, and by myself, by reviewers. It's kind of a mix. It's like elements of Speyside, but also Isla inspiration. What would kind of you describe it as if you had to do a parallel for someone maybe wanting to jump from Scotch to an American single malt from Hillrock Estate?
That's a very interesting question. So our single malt, it's 100% estate grown barley, 100% floor malted on site, small batch pod distilled. We also traditionally lauter our mash in that a lot of American single malts I think are made more like a traditional American whiskey with the grain on kind of mashing and fermentation and even distillation. We actually do. We have I think the only Vendome mash tank that was ever designed to make both American and Scotch style whiskey. So when we're making
Mhm.
single malt, we put in a false bottom, rakes and scrapers, and traditionally lauter. It's a tremendous amount of work, to be honest with you. It's probably 3 times more work than making bourbon or rye. But we end up with a whiskey that I personally am very fond of, and I like to think we have achieved our goal of making the top rated American single malt. And I think it's won best whiskey in the Los Angeles competition, beating, a lot of cult bourbons, all the single malts, much older single malts from Scotland, etc. Now, in terms of style, I think Americans like big, full bodied. The same with wines. When you take a Pinot Noir from Burgundy and you move it to the United States, it changes its personality. We make a different kind of wine, and the same with our whiskeys. So I think our single malt starts in new American oak, so it gets a punch of power and vanilla and all those kind of characteristics that you get from a charred oak cask. Then we move it to ex bourbon, and then it ultimately goes into Pedro Jimenez and Oloroso sherry casks. And then we also have a version that ends up in a port cask. So it's got this incredible complex layering to it, but it has a lot of depth and color and complexity and flavor, which I think Scotch style whiskeys or Scotch whiskeys, many of them are, obviously they go into an ex bourbon barrel typically that's been recoopered to be even larger. So the amount of surface area to volume is pretty limited. So you get a very light, kind of delicate whiskey typically. And it takes a lot of years in Scotland for it to get the personality that people are going to want. And, David done experiments back in his Maker's Mark days of swapping barrels between Scotland and the US. And he found that you got the kind of level of extraction in the US twice as fast as in Scotland. So I would argue a 6-year-old single malt or a 7-year-old single malt, which we're kind of releasing as our standard product now, is a lot more similar to a 12 or 13 or 14-year-old single malt from Scotland in terms of depth. And we do use there is peat smoke on our whiskeys, our single malts. We use a Speyside peat, which we still import. We and that makes a little bit of lighter peat kind of profile than you would get obviously from a Lagavulin or Lefroy, which I happen to be quite fond of. And if you ever come and visit again, Dave, I'd be happy to pull some of my smokier whiskeys out of I probably have some 14-year-olds up in the rick house, which we could probably find something pretty fantastic.
I would be honored. That sounds amazing. So with all that said, when you were on, about 2 years ago, when you were on What to Drink in a Rocking Chair, the host asked you, you were of two minds as to what was your favorite whiskey, so that you make. Your last meal pairing, you said, would be a double cask rye in Madeira. But later in the interview, in a different question, you said that the single malt might be your favorite because, as you just said, it's so much harder to make.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll get to the bourbon and more on the rye as well. But I thought it was fitting to ask you now, what do you think might be your favorite child if you have to make that kind of question?
I mean, David, I don't know if you're a parent, but you're not allowed to have a favorite child. I mean, you might in the back of your mind think that you have a favorite, but
I can cheat. I've only got one, so I can cheat.
You can never say that publicly. We have 3, and I don't think I can quite say that. But I think all of our whiskeys, the bourbon, rye, and single malt of each one so many medals at this point, and they've all won best whiskey in at least one or two major competitions. So I think they're all pretty extraordinary on their own light. And a lot of it might depend on what kind of a mood I am in, what I'm eating, whether I'm sitting in front of my fire in the middle of the winter, or whether I'm on my rocking chair on the porch. So I certainly, um, I can't say that I have a favorite, but I do pick different ones for different kinds of occasions, so to speak. Um, and I think our rye whiskeys are so terroir driven and so unique that it's hard not to love them. And a fabulous rye whiskey with a Pedro Jimenez, or a port or Sauterne, or finish on them, or Madeira finish. Boy, they're they're pretty extraordinary. They're almost like a cocktail already. But then again, the bourbon is the same way. It's just maybe the bourbon's a little a little bit lighter profile for me. So it might be my choice if I was an 85-degree day and I'm sitting on my porch, I might elect for a bourbon versus one of the others.
Understood. And so the bourbon should say, is the first Solera aged bourbon in the U.S. To the point that I think it took the TTB like 9 months to approve the label at first because they didn't know what they were looking at. From that, I can assume that it was the first Solera aged whiskey in the U.S. as far as you know.
No, as far as I know, yes.
Yeah.
And I think there may be a couple more now, but I'm not so sure everyone's really following the protocol the way we have. I mean, we do it virtually very traditional. There's a lot of work to do, which I'm happy to walk through if you want a little clarity on how our Solera works.
For sure. I'm going to hold a pin in that just to make sure we get through everything else I want to ask about, because of course there's always more questions than we have time for. But I do want to come back to the Solera if we have time at the end. And thankfully, you guys have it laid out beautifully in pictures and the website of how it's done. So worst case, I will always supplement in the write-up so people see what the Solera works like. I'm always interested in exceptions. And most of your bourbon goes into this Solera system, the 4-tier Solera system, after 4-ish years, but not all of it. What determines for you when a barrel stays out of the Solera?
Well, so again, these are really great points. So right now, our Solera is kind of, its scale is fixed currently, and it's designed for a level of production. We could always enlarge the Solera. That would mean making each tier larger. But we've been making bourbon for 15, 16 years, and our attitude has always been to make much more bourbon, rye or single malt, than we were selling at any given point. So in the early years, we were literally making 3 times as much whiskey as what we were targeting for sale. And the reason behind that was that we wanted to get a lot more age on our whiskeys. And we didn't want to be stuck in that mode of selling 3 or 4 or 5-year-old whiskey for very long. So now the whiskey going basically for our Solera, bourbon goes into our estate bourbon goes into new make, a new American oak, charred American oak, and it now has to be there for at least 6 years before it can start working its way through the Solera. But we have 14-year-old bourbons in stock, and we have tremendous volume of 6, 7, 8-year-old bourbons that are not going into the Solera now. So that led us to start looking at a number of years ago. It was always part of the plan was to have a separate bourbon that wouldn't work through the Solera, and that was our double cask bourbon. We started releasing about 2 years ago now. That's been a massive success, and that will continue. That product, I suspect, will ultimately overtake the scale of sales coming from the Solera. And it'll allow us to do, again, individual barrel releases in the bourbon space that are 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12-year-old bourbons that, which I think and we also do several different mash bills. So that'll give us a whole nother kind of market access effectively.
Gotcha. What is that? Is it's been a little over 2 years since I was at the facility. What is if you're making kind of a sales pitch between the two, between the Solera aged bourbon and the double cask, what does the profile for the double cask look like in comparison to the Solera aged?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think so. For starters, our first release in the double cask bourbon space was a 5-year-old bourbon, and individual barrel releases with an age statement at 100 proof, so it's bottled in bond.
Mm.
And if you have you tried it yet, David? If
I
not,
No, I haven't yet.
I'll send you a bottle because I'm not going to tell you what the mash bill is until you drink it, and then we can talk
All right.
about it. But we have multiple mash bills. I will give you a couple of clues. One of which is the Solera. I think one Oloroso finish on bourbon is fabulous. The sherry finish is incredible. I think it gives it more of a floral, nutty kind of more complexity than a lot of bourbons, and it's got a lot of depth to it from the Solera aging process. It just is a beautiful, very interesting bourbon that has a level of consistency to it on top of the complexity. I would say that the rye content in our Solera is probably 32, 33, 34%, right in that range. But we have put different mash bills into the Solera. And so the double cask bourbon, we can do separate mash bills, separate age statements, and individual barrels that are really very unique. So it just gives us an ability to explore that space a little bit more.
I like that. It's easy to be stuck in one mash bill, one profile, which could be a delicious one. I mean, like I said, the Solera bourbon has never
Yeah.
been a miss for me, but I like playing around too. It's a little more. It's fun to explore them.
Mm-hmm.
So I will take you up on that offer, and I will be sure to get back to you on what I think the mash bill is. You'll have to tell me other guesses I need to make, like what the age exactly. I know you said they're about 5 years was the first one, but I
And
won't.
now
I'll try not to look.
we'll send you a 6-year. It'll be we'll have multiple age statements, but I think what we'll probably do, the double cask bourbon has kind of um a Tiffany blue label on it, which I'm probably not supposed to say in public, but it's not exactly their color, but it's pretty
Right.
close. So it's very visible. And we also created a slightly lower entry price for that one so that we really wanted to give consumers a way to kind of experience Hillrock that maybe wouldn't have picked up, $100 plus bottle off the shelf. And it's
Mhm.
also incredibly good for cocktails. So we were looking to have a product that would be very front and central at major on premise venues. So we're starting
Mhm.
to do a lot more exploring of opening, kind of partnerships where we're doing cocktail programs.
Gotcha. much as I enjoy your single malt and bourbon, which I do, the double cask rye for me is my favorite, and because it's not mine, I can say it's my favorite. 100% rye mash bill with components of malted and unmalted rye. There weren't many distilleries using malted rye in portion or in whole when you guys started. Maybe Old Potrero, maybe one other at the time. Um, why use malted rye?
Well, I think it's kind of like so many of these things. One, we have a malt house that gives us the ability to kind of play around a bit. And one of the things we started doing very early was malting rye. And frankly, we put straight malt rye into barrels and left it in our rick houses. And 5 or 6 years later, we all of a sudden we said, hey, we should probably try that. And lo and behold, it was unbelievably delicious. And I don't know if when you were here, we happened to have, we were releasing 1 barrel a year of it, basically. And it's so extraordinary that we started making a lot more of it after that. And that's, it's given us, I might even argue that someday this region could be actually well known for single malt rye as kind of like the sophistication of a single malt Scotch style whiskey, but given where we are in our climate and everything, rye is better suited to this region, frankly. So it's an interesting question of where this will end up, but we started as more experiments and we love the nature of it. So we started making more and more of it, which then allowed us to use it in all of, in our bourbon and in our rye whiskeys on a malt form so that we wouldn't have to use it outside enzymes.
Mm. And until, like you said, until somewhat recently, the malted rye was a small production. You were releasing a barrel a year. I admittedly, I'm not sure if I tried it either time I was there, actually. I'll double check my notes from the first time that I visited. I feel like I would have remembered it only because there were so few of them. You know what I
You
mean?
would have remembered it. We probably didn't have any at the time, but
Yeah.
when you come back again, I'll try to find a bottle of it for you.
Appreciate we can make that happen. And you said you've been ramping up the malted rye production. How, not to put a timeline on it unless you want to, how long might we have to wait for more than 1 barrel a year of a 100% malted rye release?
I'll let you know when I taste the 5 and 6 year old single malt ryes that are in the rick house. I think I would anticipate in the next couple of years we'll start releasing that as a product line.
Love it. The as of was it 20? Yeah, I guess early 25. Uh, we do have a definition now for American single malt, which, call it fortunate or unfortunate, depending on what side of the aisle you're on. Unfortunately, does not allow for officially a single malt rye. But I was hoping it would because, like I said, there are a couple of producers making that. Did you have any kind of strong input or strong feeling on how the American single malt regulation came out, particularly given that you have this, what could be called a single malt rye?
Again, I've always been an advocate for allowing innovation in the space, frankly. I think as we as we saw back in the 70s with the Judgment of Paris in the wine world, there's room for innovation in the industry. And I frankly think people should have as much flexibility as they want. If they're making single malt, they should be able to decide whether they're aging in new oak or used oak. So I was an advocate of creating the new definition. I'm not really, we've had discussion about that whole Empire Rye concept and all of that. And I think for the most part, our standards are the highest that you can possibly have in the industry, in terms of estate grown 100% of our grain is estate grown. All the processes happen here, floor malting, all of that. So I've never been, I don't, we're not really adopting things like the Empire Rye designation for us because in many ways, I think we've set our standards and we're not changing them, and they're as high as you can possibly make them. So, for single malt and, a single malt rye, we'll release it as a single malt rye and we'll call it that. And the industry it won't be widely distributed. I mean, the industry isn't going to move in that direction quickly. Look, we've been doing this for 16 years, and frankly, Kentucky just looked up a couple of years ago and started realizing the state concept was a pretty good idea. So, I suspect it'll be a few more years before people seize on single malt rye like we have. But we'll start winning more awards with that, and then people maybe will notice.
It's been one of my favorite types of products. I won't speak to yours yet because I know, like I said, I'm not pretty sure. I guess that I haven't tasted it if I don't remember it that well because I would have. But in looking at others who have done it, Old Potrero, Amrut from India, having
Mm-hmm.
single.
Yeah.
These are some of my favorite ryes that I've tried in the last couple of years. The malt does something for the rye that just punches out that flavor even more. And as much as I'm a rye guy to begin with, it's next level. So I look forward to
Well, I think it
visiting
creates
again.
it creates a delicacy and a level of sophistication that a regular unmalted rye just doesn't. It just takes it to another level, I think.
Mhm.
So, and we do, for some of our single malt ryes, we also do add fruit and nut wood smoke to them, which creates like a whole different profile. So, anyways, we'd love to. And when you're back up, we'll have you try them.
For sure. So I want to pivot a little bit, which is to talk about your casks. We've spoken a little bit about the finishings and about Dave knowing how to work with those smaller casks to make them work, really, to be blunt. Whereas I think in the industry, they built a reputation, smaller casks in general, for over oaking or not being handled well, let's say. So, Dave was known for pushing for longer air drying for staves in particular, aiming to get rid of the tannins, other undesirable compounds. For your new casks, mostly from Kelvin, you said you won't go below 24 months air dried, but sometimes have gone as long as 48 to 60 months, 4 to 5 years air dried. I don't think I've had any other whiskeys with staves air dried longer than maybe 30 to 36 months. What happens to the wood and thus the whiskey after that long of an air drying period?
Well, first, I'll never forget, we once got a load of barrels, and Dave inspected them, and they were 18-month air dried, and he sent them back. We had a firm requirement that they had to be at least 24 months. And as you know, the wood has to be, first of all, an oak tree has to have been growing for about 100 years or so to make a
Mm.
barrel out of it. And then it's cut into staves and it's stacked outside. So air drying is a little bit of a misnomer in that what really happens is it gets rained on, it gets sun on it, and it
Yeah.
does leach a lot of the tannin out of the wood. So it makes a much different kind of a whiskey with longer air drying. And we've used 3 or so coopers. I mean, from day one, we've always had the highest quality barrels because Dave had relationships with them, even when there was real shortage and it was very difficult for craft distillers to get quality barrels. We started experimenting with much longer air drying periods, and we were really fortunate. Our friends at Adirondack Cooperage, we hadn't been using their barrels, and they kept sending us barrels and asking us if we would try them. And they had 5+ year air dried wood. And honestly, when you smelled that barrel, the inside of that barrel, and compared it to a 24-month or 18-month air dried barrel, you just knew the whiskeys were going to be extraordinary. You could tell it's the barrel production is so critical. I mean, the proper toasting and then the proper charring, but starting with the level of air dry is so important. So we've loved the whiskeys that have come out of these longer air dried barrels, and they just become a little bit more, again, a little bit more sophisticated, a little more delicate. So yes, we've really embraced that, and thank goodness for guys like Dave who told us that it was important, because I don't think I would have known that without him.
For cask finishings in particular, you've aimed to get barrels from wine producers that you enjoy, which, I mean, that makes sense. To me, it's either the ones you enjoy or the ones who are local to you and can enhance their terroir, the sense of place.
Mm-hmm.
Are there still some after a decade and a half that have eluded your grasp, so to speak?
Oh, I'm sure there are, and we're looking to build partnerships with cask, with folks in the wide world, and usually that means my wife or I or both of us effectively have to meet them. They have to like us. They have to like our whiskeys, and then surprisingly, someone like Dick Shea calls you up and says, I'm dumping my best barrels. Would you like me to send you several? And we're like, great, we'll ship them in. And I think it makes not only a really high quality whiskey, but it also creates just this sort of camaraderie and partnership in this industry that's such a fun place to be functioning. So we definitely want to build more of those relationships, and I might say there might be a Sauterne producer or two that we might like to get barrels from, but haven't been able to yet. Maybe we will. And unfortunately, we're not quite like some of the big whiskey producers that might have millions of dollars to make a partnership with someone where they get an exclusive on their barrels. That's just, that's not going to happen with us. We're just not big enough. So we have to use our charm and good whiskeys to get barrel manufacturers to send us a few.
And if it's the same winemaker and Sauterne maker that I'm thinking of as well, you'd also have to figure out a way to not only get their casks, but then have it not be cost prohibitive for a consumer.
Yeah.
Those are some expensive casks and bottles.
Yeah, I don't know if people are really, how excited they're going to be to pay, $1,000 a bottle for their Hillrock versus, 100. So we'll see.
And I do want to, note that too, as you said earlier in talking about the new double cask bottled and bond bourbon, Hillrock is not for lack of a better term, it's not a budget brand. It's definitely going to be, with that release exception, it's more in the 100 to 150 range for the bottles. I think the two bottles that I had were about 125 to 150. But from what I've seen, you might not go below that, but you also don't really go above that. Like, there's not a $250 or $300, $500 bottle of Hillrock. It's within a pretty defined range where it's not, at least it's not one where you're going to maybe pick up a bottle every other week, but it's also not one where you have to save for months on end to get this super ultra premium bottling. When you're taking into account that balance between the quality and the inputs that you have, but also making sure that people can and want to buy more bottles and keep the cycle going. How often do you have to either evaluate or rebalance those two competing sides?
Well, I think that there's, I mean, we've never wanted to create this kind of, ridiculous, unapproachable price point. Because we certainly want consumers to be able to enjoy Hillrock. And my theory has always been, you know, you buy a $100 or $150 bottle of Hillrock, and it's it's going to last you a little while, and you're going to enjoy it. And it's not, you spend $100 bottle on or $100 on a bottle of wine, and it's gone in an evening, at dinner. And I'm not sure. I think our whiskeys are still incredible value given the amount of time and effort and everything that we put into them. And we've tried not to really go crazy with pricing. I mean, we do have some releases now that are $250 or $280
Mm,
that are really small, releases.
mm,
But yeah, I want us to be a value still for consumers. And I do think consumers, if they understand the story and the care, and especially when someone's come here and seen the facility, they understand that there's a reason why that costs 100 or $150. It's because we're sustainably farming 800
mm,
acres, and because we're floor malting on site and doing everything by hand in small production level and small batches. And I think people appreciate that, and they're going to enjoy it and be able to tell their friends about it, enjoy a glass. We've never expected people to be using Hillrock as their kind of as their everyday sort of go to town on kind of bourbon. And
sure.
but I do encourage people to use it for a great Manhattan once in a while because boy, it's delicious. Anyway, did I answer your
Mm,
question? I'm not sure.
yes, yeah, yeah. Uh, so from the pivoting a little bit to the 30,000 foot view again, from the beginning, this has clearly been a passion project for you. But it was only a couple of years ago that this became more your primary focus.
Hmm.
Uh, you had a you yourself had a successful career in real estate investment banking. Kathy, as far as I can tell, is still going strong in luxury real estate. So this was kind of a, I don't want to say secondary because I don't know the proportions involved of time spent. But a couple years ago, maybe 2022, you started winding down the finance business that really facilitated this this distillery and the work you're doing. Uh, what made you feel like this timing was right to say I'm putting this part of my career in the past and I'm really going to focus fully on the distillery going forward?
Well, okay, so from day one, we knew that we wanted to make, if we're going to do this, we wanted to make really the best whiskey that you could possibly make. And that requires a lot of patience and capital. And so
Mm,
we didn't want to have the case where we had partners or debt and we're being forced to sell, you know, immature whiskeys and be pushed around, so to speak. So we set our standards really high, and we were able to take our time doing things because of that. So that puts us in this position where we have 12-year-old whiskeys that are really unbelievably delicious. And now we have, I like to say I have a lot of liquid assets at the farm at this point. And so we were slowly building this business over 15 years. It was never meant to be you know, do it in 3 years and buy a bunch of seed whiskey and ramp up a business and sell it. That was not the business model. It was to make a generational business that could really impact the industry and impact our area. and to make this a destination for visitors and all of that. So, and I think we've been able to do that. So, um, I guess after COVID was winding down and I had spent most of my time up here for a couple of years, I frankly wasn't that prepared to go back to New York and, be in that environment again 24 hours a day. So, and at the same time, we'd build up just an incredible inventory of whiskeys that were beginning to, and that big expansion we did in 2019, those whiskeys, are now coming of age and are ready to start being sold. So the plan is to, we're only distributed in maybe 15 states or something like that right now. The plan is to create, a real business where Hillrock's distributed throughout the US and probably into some key cities in Europe as well, and maybe Asia. And that takes a lot of work, so um, we kind of looked at the whole situation and decided that it was time for me to shift my attention to doing that. So that's really what I'm focused on now, is building out the business and maintaining the quality that we've become known for. But we're going to start expanding our reach.
So, looking forward and looking back. The first being, I want to come back to the Estate Whiskey Alliance. So,
Mhm.
as you said earlier, it was only a couple of years ago that Kentucky kind of looked up and saw that estate whiskeys were being made in New York, in Illinois, in Nevada, so and other states than just Kentucky. And I think one of the founding partners is a Canadian distillery as well. So
Mhm.
outside of Kentucky, let's say. You and Hillrock are one of the founding members of the Estate Whiskey Alliance. What was it like being part of this creation? Did University of Kentucky come to you? Did you go to them? What was it like?
Well, it's really, this is a fantastic topic and so much fun to get into, and I'm proud of being part of it, and I'm so excited about the opportunities. So, I think the whole evolution was such that there were a couple factors driving Kentucky distilleries. And, we obviously had a connection back to Maker's Mark through Dave Pickerell, for starters, but I believe, and it might be interesting to have this discussion with Rob Samuels or Seth DeBolt, who's the head of the Beam Institute. But somewhere, about 7 years ago or so, the Beam Institute was formed, maybe 8 now. And they had hired a fellow by the name of Seth DeBolt, who is um, from the wine world and was UC Davis trained. And they brought him to University of Kentucky to start building up their whiskey consulting research capability. And he looked up and said, "My gosh, you don't have the equivalent of like a UC Davis in the whiskey world, and you should have one." So he was instrumental in bringing in some of his good friends, the part of the Centauri family, to fund largely to fund the cost of building out the Beam Institute. And I think as part of that, because of his wine background, he started looking at other things happening in the industry. And at the same time, my understanding from discussions with Rob and some of the others was that Rob had become a big regenerative farming advocate. By the way, Rob Samuels is an 8th generation distiller in his family. It's incredible to think about that. And they were making rye whiskey in Pennsylvania in the early 1700s, and then moved across the mountains to Kentucky and ultimately started making bourbon. So I think Rob had been noticing what we were doing for a number of years, at least a decade. And maybe we created some inspiration for Star Hill Farms and for this kind of connection back to the land, and his desire to have more sustainable regenerative farming practices in Kentucky. So all that kind of got things going. And at some point in there, you know, University of Kentucky got into a discussion with us about the alliance, and I started thinking about it, and my view was that consumers don't understand what we're doing at Hillrock. Really, they don't yet understand it generally, and I think that they would care very much about what we're doing if they understood it and heard the story. So that once they get to the distillery, they love us. Once they taste our whiskeys, they love us. But we need more. We needed help from the industry to get that word out, and having people like Maker's Mark involved in creating publicity. And when the Beam Institute started the Estate Whiskey Alliance, they had more social media click-throughs or interaction of anything they've ever done. It's staggering. So consumers actually care. So the bottom line of it is we got into discussions, and I thought it was fabulous that the industry was finally beginning to understand what the estate whiskey movement meant and what it could mean for the industry. So I was proud to be a part of it, and hopefully we have had a fair amount of influence on that movement. And I think it's just going to build steam rapidly now. So yeah, I'm really excited about it. And I'm spending a tremendous amount of time out in Kentucky at the Beam Institute. Terroir studies are being done by University of Kentucky. Sustainability, man, I mean, we're a model of sustainability in terms of farming practices and all of that. And I think there's just so much for the industry to kind of grab hold of. I'm not saying that, Beam is going to make 16 million 9-liter cases a year, in a state production, but I bet you there's a point at which 10% or 20% of the big distilleries production could be estate. And then I think, someday there will be an estate whiskey section at your local whiskey store. And all of that, I think, will change perceptions pretty meaningfully.
I definitely hope to talk to Seth and Rob at some point, because I've spoken to several members of the Estate Whiskey Alliance at this point, and it is something with the terroir focus that I appreciate. It's something that's really unique. And to me, in hearing you describe it, I was immediately struck by the comparison or the parallel with when Beam came out with the Claremont Steep American Single Malt. It was before the formal regulations had been adopted, but I think around the same time, maybe contemporaneous or right after the public comment period. And I know a number of smaller distilleries were asked, are you afraid that Claremont Steep, that's the big guys, have entered the American single malt space? And most of them said, not really. I mean, if you're going to buy Beam, you're already going to buy them. And if anything else, it brings more visibility to the rest of us to say there's this giant display in the American single malt category now for Claremont Steep. If the eyes are brought to this aisle, this shelf on the aisles, then people are probably going to see our products there as well. And maybe they take a flyer on us they wouldn't have if they didn't see us otherwise. So I see it's another rising tide kind of parallel there.
Mm-hmm. I think 100%. I mean, and consumers are I mean, they're smarter and smarter all the time, and they're spending a lot of time researching. And if this younger generation is drinking a little bit less, but they want a story and a quality product, and they want to understand the facts. And I think there was a view from the Beam, from University of Kentucky that maybe whiskey hasn't always been the most transparent industry. Wine maybe has a slightly better sort of perception out in the market. But there wasn't a certification program in the wine space, but they felt that having a third-party certification for estate whiskeys would be meaningful in the whiskey industry. So that's a big portion of the whole Estate Whiskey Alliance University of Kentucky program, which is basically certifying whiskeys. So we had the first certified bourbon rye single malts designation from the Estate Whiskey Alliance. And I think consumers are going to start understanding what that means ultimately, and it will give them a confidence and a reason and a justification for buying products that they think are meeting their requirements. And part of it will be sustainability. Part of it will be, the quality and the fact that they have a local story and a terroir. So I'm just incredibly excited about it.
Here, because I'll just have you stay on for just a minute after we finish the recording to close out. So bear with me on that. 2 questions for you on legacy and looking forward. And one of them, to bring it back to Dave, he clearly, as you said, he put a lot of time and effort into Hillrock Estate. With Whistlepig, it was arguably his two biggest post-makers projects. He spent time on the road for you guys, left a mark across the whole distillery. Do you feel, and without any slight to his other projects and partners, do you feel that you have a larger share of his legacy and perhaps thus a larger responsibility to his legacy?
Look, he was an amazing individual, an amazing professional, and we're so fortunate to have had him play this role in Hillrock, and we couldn't have done it without him. There's just no question about it. So we're indebted to him for that, and we'll maintain that legacy forever. In terms of, I think it's a we have a debt to pay to him effectively in terms of maintaining that legacy and quality, and we always will. And he trained all of our staff and set up all our protocols and all of our mash bills, and we're never going to stray from that, I don't think. Now, so yes, I feel and I suspect our Solera bourbon is one of the few places you can still find Dave Pickerell distilled whiskey in that Solera bourbon. So I think he lives on with us, and which is an important factor. But it's we certainly miss him. But he did everything the right way with us, and we have all the protocols and everything set up so that we're able to just continue operating. Frankly, I mean, we miss him, but he did a great job of putting in all the controls that we needed to be able to be successful.
And then the final question, which is, what do you either see right now, or what do you want Hillrock Estate's legacy to be?
I mean, I think it's a pretty simple view. We want to be known as being our whiskeys being the highest possible quality and being effectively, they can't be duplicated anywhere else. They're so unique to our location and our terroir, and we want to embrace that, and we want people to recognize it and enjoy them. And I think that's the bottom line of it. I think we hopefully have built an image and a legacy in the industry that will just keep embellishing. And I think someday, Hillrock may be a little bit more of a household name as we begin to grow out that business. But I want to be an international brand with a recognition amongst consumers and amongst experts as being really the highest quality that you can be. So that's pretty much it. And hopefully one of our sons is now in the business, and hopefully, he carries that on.
Awesome. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for coming on to talk about Hillrock Estate Distillery in, again, my home state of New York. I'm always proud to talk to distilleries from New York. I will definitely make it a point to get up there. I'll shoot you a couple of dates. Hang out with me for just a sec after we finish recording, like I said. And I will, when I do get up to Hillrock, I'll post an update as well for what we got to taste and what we've seen, and some photos that maybe I haven't shared before of just being there and experiencing what it's like.
Great.
So thank you everyone for listening. This has been another episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. Please like, rate, and subscribe wherever you listen. Let's keep those 5-star ratings going on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and I will see you all next week.